Ready to go? Okay, hi everybody, Premier David Eby. Thank you for joining us again this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here with my colleague Andrew Furey, Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. I've really enjoyed getting to know the Premier, and one of the reasons why is we have such common issues between British Columbia and Newfoundland and Labrador, from fisheries issues, concerns about the management of our fisheries and the mismanagement, frankly, in some cases. Opportunities that we see around hydrogen for Newfoundland and Labrador export to Europe, for British Columbia export to Asia. The common issues of having a significant coastline and marine industry, and just generally him being a really good guy. So I've enjoyed our conversations. I've learned a lot. And in Premier Furey's recent visit to British Columbia, he raised with me that Newfoundland was contemplating and was preparing litigation relating to the issue of equalization. We canvassed the issue in some detail during that visit in Vancouver. I really appreciated that he took the time to come visit. And I asked my team, and we did some additional work in British Columbia to have a look at this. Our Attorney General met with his team. They had multiple conversations between the legal teams to understand the nature of Newfoundland's arguments that they're intending to make, why they're taking this approach, and ultimately I'm here to share with you today that we have decided to provide our full support to Newfoundland's litigation strategy, to their lawsuit around equalization. There's no question that there are differences in the arguments that we would make to the court around equalization, but the theme is consistent. We feel that it's unreasonable for BC taxpayers to be sending money to the federal government to be distributed to provinces like Ontario through the equalization program, which is part of our Constitution. And the Constitution is really clear. It says that this program is to ensure a minimum level of service for all Canadians, which is something I think every British Columbian supports. What we struggle to support is the idea that when British Columbians are struggling with affordability, they're struggling with the cost of living, to ask them to pay into a federal system that distributes money to another province that is not having challenges delivering basic services. Ontario has challenges, absolutely, we all do across Canada, but delivering basic services is not one of their challenges. The system is clearly broken, and the federal government made an explicit decision not to sit down and to renegotiate the formula with premiers. Every 5 years, they're supposed to do a review. And when you have problems like Ontario receiving $1 billion in equalization over the last couple of years, that's the time when you are able to address those issues in the formula. Unfortunately, they decided not to do that. And so that leaves only one venue available to us. My pledge, our government's pledge to Newfoundland, is that we will intervene in the case at the appropriate moment as our legal teams discuss. We'll share all information with them to support their claim at the trial level. We'll coordinate with them on legal strategy. And in addition, British Columbia will look at whether we should be filing our own litigation in British Columbia, because as I said, there are some points of difference. For example, the treatment of property values and property taxes is an issue where we have a different perspective between our two provinces, and where we think we can bring a different perspective to the court through an intervention or potentially through our own lawsuit in British Columbia. I also want to be clear, it's not about a dispute with any premier across Canada. Every premier I've talked to about this, I had a lengthy bilateral with Premier Legault, is committed to, for their own provinces where they're receiving equalization, to not receive equalization. Premier Legault, for example, has increased their GDP in Quebec and reduced their dependence to, I think he said, from 20% to 16%. Which is great for Quebec. This is about me as the Premier of British Columbia making sure that the federal government is aware that I'm going to stand up for British Columbians and make sure that we are not, as British Columbians, paying into a federal system that has perverse outcomes. In addition to it, equalization for British Columbia, we have struggled with the fact that we're paying into this system that is providing so much to the people of Ontario, the people of Quebec, and yet the people of Ontario and the people of Quebec appear to have access to federal funding that is not available to British Columbia. Whether it's the recent announcement about funding for a Northern Indigenous hospital in Ontario, whether it was the announcement of the bridge in Quebec, whether it was the battery plants, in excess of $20 billion of federal support. These are not programs that are available to British Columbia. And to have the equalization unfairness coupled with special treatment, programs available only to those provinces, is just too much to bear. So we'll make the case for British Columbians in court. I want to thank Newfoundland and Labrador and Premier Furey for his leadership on this issue and for bringing us along and for briefing me about this unfairness. And I really look forward to working with Newfoundland and Labrador on this important court challenge. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Premier, and it's certainly an honor to have you join our case. As you suggested, maybe slight differences of opinions about some of the calculus and the micro mathematics, if you will, but we are consistent and well aligned that this is a question of fairness for Canadians. This formula requires by the Constitution that there is consideration and contemplation of not just equivalence of taxation, which is easy to calculate by math, but equivalence of services. And there is no reflection of that in how the federal government assigns the allocation and the distributions of equalization. So at a very basic level, it's A minus B equals C, and we're only talking about A and C, and we're not talking about B. We should be talking about the cost to deliver services in rural and northern British Columbia, the cost to deliver services in rural and remote Newfoundland and Labrador. But the spirit is one that we agree on, I think, is one that the Federation was built on, that there should be protection of equivalence of services across the country. But there is no proxy for that in the current contemplation. So we're very grateful that Premier Eby has joined our fight to make sure that this formula is revisited. We're not saying, by the way, that we have the solution right now. We're asking for the courts to evaluate the fairness of it, the mathematical calculations of it, and hopefully that offers all Canadians the opportunity to have a broader conversation about not just the spirit, but the distribution of the outcome of this formula. So we're very grateful for Premier Eby to join. We had great conversations in British Columbia when I visited. He came to Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'll end where he started. We have so much in common between Newfoundland and Labrador and British Columbia, and it really speaks to the brilliance of the country that we can be so far apart yet so close together. And I'm very grateful for your leadership. I'm very grateful for your friendship, and this is a sign of how the Federation should work. Because this challenge, as you note, has, despite the differences of geography, despite the differences of political color, this is a challenge that we think is fundamentally built on an unfairness and an unfair allocation of the formula itself.
Can reporters on the phone line please press *1 to enter the queue, and please come off mute when called on so we can hear you here. One question, one follow-up, and we'll start with questions in the room. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Premiers. Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News. With this announcement today and comments we heard earlier this week about how Ottawa should stick to its lane, how would you both describe the state of federal-provincial relations after these meetings?
Yeah, I'll let you grab your thoughts. I think, Canadians expect that all levels of government work together. Canada works best. The vision of Canada works best when all levels of government work together. I think there's a common concern expressed across the different provinces about blurring of jurisdictional lines and jurisdictional creep. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we're happy to work with the federal government, but make no mistake, we don't work for the federal government. So we're happy to have discussions about things like childcare. We've already proven that we can work together. That is a level of provincial jurisdiction which we have shown the ability to cooperate on. What we're unhappy about is the overreach at times and waking up and hearing about announcements that are exclusively provincial jurisdiction. which if we had had a conversation before, perhaps there's levels of ability to work together and collaborate on. That's what Canadians expect. That's what they deserve. And frankly, that's when the Federation works best.
For British Columbia's part, it's my firm belief that the best results will be delivered for British Columbians, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's an effective healthcare system, whether it's the regulation of our fisheries, or I'm hearing there's going to be a transit announcement, you name it. The best results will come from us working closely with the federal government when they want to fund these things, and we can tailor it to British Columbia's realities. And we can help them avoid mistakes. I think is probably the most important thing. It's just a waste of money when you screw things up and then have to undo them and redo them and try to align two different programs, and you have officials applying to multiple programs for them. It's a headache. And so all we're saying is come to the table. Have conversations with us. We've had multiple years now of requests from the Premier's table to have conversations about infrastructure, for example. There are so many misunderstandings, duplications, so much waste that could be avoided. And for my part, I know British Columbians will be better represented in a Canada and better supported in a Canada where the federal level and the provincial level are working closely together. And that's just not what's happening right now.
Thank you. On another subject, some of your counterparts just before you entered today's meetings talked about Canada's plan to reach the NATO benchmark of spending 2% of GDP on defense. The federal government's current plan is to do this by 2032, but some of your colleagues, including Premier Canoe and Premier Ford, said that needs to be sped up. So I want to hear from both of you. What are your positions on that?
I'm fully supportive, and as you've already articulated with Premier Canoe, and I think there is a broad consensus across premiers. I don't want to speak for other premiers, but I know in Newfoundland and Labrador we've been fighting for four years since I became premier for the federal government to please use an asset that exists in Newfoundland and Labrador, Five-Wing Goose Bay. It's a modern, well-maintained base in the north that could provide training facilities. NATO partners have come to my office and asked to use the facility. We want them to use the facility. It rightfully belongs to the federal government. But we think that this is a way that they can easily start contributing without having to duplicate and create infrastructure projects. There's one that exists. Just invest a little bit more in it. Take it from being warm idle to being active. And I was interested to hear conversations across the country where there are these kind of warm idled assets that belong to the Department of Defense that could easily be upscaled and easily be occupied either by Canadians, which we've got the best armed forces in the world, no question about it, the hardworking women and men who work in that, we all owe them a debt of gratitude, or our NATO partners. And Five-Wing Goose Bay is certainly an example of that in Happy Valley Goose Bay.
Thanks. In British Columbia, military-related issues are most front of mind for us in the forest fire season. We've been just so grateful when the military shows up and provides assistance in British Columbia and stands with our wildfire fighters and supports us in that work. We want them to be well supported in turn by the federal government. Our anxiety, and I think the anxiety of many British Columbians, is looking at the possibility of a Trump administration coming in the United States. And our close relationship south of the border, especially down the west coast of the United States, in terms of trade, people-to-people relationships, and opportunity in both directions. We are major customers for U.S. companies, and likewise, British Columbia companies profit significantly from American customers as well. And whether you're talking about our film and television industry or any other number of relationships that we have, having a tight relationship with the United States is critically important, and I think it's unambiguous, the message from a potentially incoming Republican administration around what their expectations are from Canada around investments in defense. So to head that off, we really encourage the federal government to be prepared for that, to be prepared for an incoming Republican administration, so that we're taking that off the table as one of the possible areas of dispute. And then we can talk about things like softwood, we can talk about other sort of trade irritant issues that Americans may have with us and deal with that on the level instead of talking about things like defense.
Judy Trin with CTV News. Can we just touch a little more on the NATO? In order to meet the 2%, defense budget currently right now is about $30 billion annually. To hit that 2% mark just this year on an annual basis would require an additional $15 to $20 billion annually. At the same time, premiers are asking for investment in healthcare, in housing. Where should the money come from? And how, it seems like that's a problem.
So I can speak from the BC perspective. There are significant dual use opportunities where the federal government is going to have to put money in anyway. And it also has the benefit of meeting the NATO obligation. So for example, we have an armed forces base in Esquimalt. One of the big challenges we face in the Victoria Capital Regional District is housing shortage. The federal government is in early explorations, we understand, about putting military housing on that base for the families to support them so that they're not out looking for housing in the broader community. Putting some military housing in on that base would be a win for us around housing affordability, around vacancy rates, and would move towards addressing some of that expenditure. Similarly, on wildfire, we are increasingly hopeful that the federal government will be supporting the military and the training and the response and the equipment to be able to respond to wildfire in British Columbia. Again, this is dual use. It benefits us right now this summer, but it also meets those obligations. I can't speak for Andrew, but I suspect the issues are the same. We have major issues with fishing fleets, international fishing fleets, accessing salmon off the coast of British Columbia. Our salmon fishers, they look at this and they say, why are these international fleets sucking up our salmon? Our allocation, and we have insufficient presence along the coast to address that issue. Again, by providing that support, it's a benefit for salmon-dependent communities right up and down the coast. So there's lots of ways to address this issue while simultaneously addressing other issues of concern that we have at the provincial level.
Very similar comments, but make no mistake, national defense is critically important, especially in this time of shifting geopolitical tensions. It's too late if things escalate to say we should have invested. The time is now to invest, given the tensions that exist around the world, given the uncertainty that exists around the world. And while you may try to pit one pot against the other, I don't subscribe to that. I think that there are indirect economic benefits, as the Premier have pointed out, in different communities where the national, where our forces, the hardworking women and men who want to be a part of this, who want to protect us, who want to go the extra mile, they deserve the investment, and to not be there for them is not right. It's not right ever, but especially in this heightened level of security risk across the world. And we have a NATO commitment. We should honor it. It does not mean that you can't invest in housing. It does not mean that, like, that's a false dichotomy in my opinion. Like, just because you invest in one place, you can't invest in something else. The indirect and economic impacts of bases and communities and the economic impacts that provides to our province, I'm sure to yours as well, is quite significant. So it's not a dollar spent, a dollar out, first of all. But I don't think it's one versus the other. I think that the federal government needs to step up, honor its commitments. The time is now. The time is now to support the hardworking women and men who are on the front lines to protect us in this time of uncertainty. Full stop.
At the same time that BC is joining Newfoundland and Labrador in its legal fight against how equalization is calculated, is it causing, you say that it's not causing any rifts in other provincial relationships, but yet at the same time you single out Quebec and Ontario, that they are getting favored treatment. Why do you think those provinces are being favored, and how are you handling those issues of potential division amongst other premiers when you launch this equalization fight?
Well, I've had good conversations with a number of premiers today. We had a conversation around the table around British Columbia joining the equalization challenge. My message to the premiers is very straightforward, and to the people of Ontario and Quebec. My job is to advocate for British Columbians, full stop. And Premier Legault's job is to advocate for Quebec residents, and Premier Ford's job is to advocate for Ontarians. I'll say Premier Ford and Premier Legault, have advocated they have accessed pots of federal money that have not been made available to British Columbians. That's not their fault. It's the federal government's responsibility to ensure that fairness. The equalization formula every 5 years was supposed to be reviewed to prevent perverse outcomes like British Columbia taxpayers sending money to support Ontarians. There's a lot of Ontarians I know and love, including my own mom. But I don't think British Columbia taxpayers should be sending money to support her in Ontario. So it's instead of doing that review at the 5-year mark, they decided to just roll it over without that conversation that we needed to have. Again, that's not about Premier Legault or Premier Ford or Ontarians or Quebecois. It's about the decisions made by the federal government, and it's why we're resorting to this, frankly, I think quite an exceptional and unusual situation of needing to go to court to do something that we should have done and we should have had the opportunity to do around the table with the federal government.
I don't really have much more to add other than that it isn't, despite it appearing to be a territorial debate, it really isn't. I don't have any particular issue with Quebec's entitlements. I don't have any issue with people in PEI getting money. It's not the question. The question from us is this formula being adequately and fairly and justly applied to all Canadians, regardless of where you live? And to my initial point, there's no contemplation for equivalence of delivery of services and the cost mechanisms associated with it. So kudos, as you suggest, to other governments who have received more money, whether it be through equalization or other streams. Well done. This is not about it's not about trying to take. It's about trying to have a formula that was enshrined in the Constitution, justly and fairly applied for all Canadians.
Hi there, Premiers. Lindsay Armstrong with Canadian Press. Premier Legault said yesterday that some provinces have agreed to receive asylum seekers who arrived into Quebec. I'm wondering, has British Columbia or Newfoundland and Labrador agreed to accept any of these people to relieve pressure on Quebec?
You go, yep.
British Columbia is already accepting and welcoming a significant number of refugees and asylum seekers. We're third in Canada, but I accept the premise of Premier Legault, which is that Quebec has seen way more arrivals of asylum seekers and along with Ontario, than any other province in Canada. Our commitment to Premier Legault and to Premier Ford was quite straightforward. Where we have housing available, where we have support from the federal government for it, we're happy to support them with the challenge that they're facing. I think that's the Canadian way. And that was the sentiment. I won't speak for any other provinces, but that was the sentiment that I felt around the table, is where we're able to help, we will. And British Columbia is increasing our number of migrants that are arriving each year in the province. And I do think it is a matter that needs federal government attention about the origin of migrants who are making claims in British Columbia, the length of time it takes to process those claims and address them. And that was one of the key topics we addressed around the table as well.
I had that conversation with Premier Legault as well, and believe it or not, Newfoundland and Labrador proportionally takes more refugees than most across the country, not as an absolute, but as a proportion in terms of our immigration allocation. That said, we don't take as many asylum seekers, and I confirmed with him that we were happy to do our part proportionally, as long as it comes with, and it should come, as it has for him, come with federal government support.
Would both of you mind elaborating on the numbers behind that? Talk about the capacity that both of your provinces actually have in terms of taking in more of these migrants.
Well, one of the pieces that I've tried to underline for both the federal government and around the table is in British Columbia, we're seeing unprecedented population inflows from immigration generally, from a number of different categories, and temporary residents, as well as more traditional streams of immigration, as well as asylum seekers. So we're talking about well in excess of 10,000 people a month. Our most recent total for last year was 180,000 new British Columbians. And that's great, and that's exciting, and it's necessary, and it's completely overwhelming. To add a new city of 180,000 people every year to our province is not sustainable. Our schools are full. We are unable to keep up with housing starts, despite significant and record-setting rental housing and housing for purchase starts. And so in the communique, and one of the things we've been talking about around the table is how do we link up our immigration targets and the federal government's immigration work with the reality on the ground of what we have capacity for. And so it's a much larger conversation than asylum seekers, which I understand is front of mind in Quebec and Ontario. But we don't want to lose the overall picture of how dramatically a population is growing, certainly in British Columbia, and the impacts that that's having on the ground in terms of our ability just to keep up.
I would say proportionally we're able to accommodate. And one of the things that came out in the, so our absolutes are much different, obviously, on a per scale basis than British Columbia's, but we're happy to act proportionately as long as it comes with federal support. And we do have some capacity. We have taken asylum seekers in the past, by the way, and we tried to track them, and some of them end up returning to Quebec despite our best efforts. But we're interested in playing the part that we can play. Yeah.
Heidi Petracek with Global National. Thanks for being here again. Premier Furey, a question for you back to the equalization question. What would you change in the formula in terms of including costs? Like there's all kinds of costs that you deal with. So how would you decide what costs you'd like included?
Sure. Well, if there are proxies that other countries have used for similar equalization programs, like in Australia. So I think it deserves a conversation about what should be included or shouldn't be included, just like the 5 elements that are included in the revenue stream. There should be at least some contemplation of the cost to deliver services. There's none now. So that deserves an open and fulsome conversation of what should be included. But if you look at healthcare, the sector that I come from, there's no way you can tell me that the same cost to do it, there's the same cost per unit to do a hip replacement in downtown Toronto, not to pick on Ontario by any stretch, as it is in St. Anthony. It's just not, the cost is not the same. There's no one, the scale is not there, the turnover is not there, it's not the same per unit. So there are different proxies that are available throughout the world, and that should be a conversation that we should be having. But to neglect it entirely, I think is wrong. And I think there's just a basic assumption that, oh, there's equivalent services in British Columbia as there is in Manitoba, as there is in Newfoundland and Labrador, and perhaps there is, but there's been no contemplation, no evidence, no suggestion that there's any thought behind it, and that's what we're asking for.
Another question for yourself and Premier Eby, if you want to weigh in. A court challenge is costly. It takes a long time. What are the odds you would stick with it, or could something change in the interim that would change your mind?
Well, we'll always be open to other resolutions outside the courts, but we felt like at this time, given the fact that they had been, the equalization had been rolled over without discussion, that this was the only mechanism available to us. And while it may be costly, I mean, not to pick on any particular province, but let's just say the other eastern provinces, between 2010 and 2023 received over $150 billion in equalization. I ask you, do you know the grand sum total of the equalization payments to Newfoundland and Labrador in the same period? 0. So the cost of any lawsuit is pretty minimal when you compare it to that.
Good afternoon, Patrick Belrose, Journal de Québec, Journal de Montréal. Premier Furey, you've touched on this, but I'd like to hear you a bit more. As you know, the formula for equalization is based on a per capita calculation. So could you explain to people in Quebec why it is unfair to people in your province to have this formula that we have presently?
Well, it's not necessarily based on a per capita basis. It's yeah. So our issue is number one on the fairness, and we've already discussed that we don't have to repeat the equivalence of services debate. And by the way, that exists for Quebec too. Northern Quebec, surely they have the same cost of delivery issues that we have in Newfoundland and Labrador. With respect to the fiscal calculations, in particular, former Prime Minister Harper in 2008, the last time that this formula was really reevaluated and inserted a fiscal capacity cap, which looks at how you develop, looks at your natural resource revenue, and then there was two contemplations. One was at 50% or one was a discount of 100%, and they ended up discounting 100%, which is incredibly punitive to Newfoundland and Labrador and Saskatchewan specifically. More broadly, however, that leads to a perverse situation in which perhaps jurisdictions don't want to develop natural resources. I think, you know, Canada is a big, bold, courageous country that has beautiful natural resources that will be a natural resource-based economy for quite some time, and to have a program that potentially disincentivizes development of natural resources doesn't make sense with the country of who we are. So our issue is, just to be clear, is on the fairness element, and then there are some issues with respect to the contemplation and the use of natural resource revenue streams within the calculation itself. I mean, there's other issues that we can get into, but the calculation is complex, as you're aware. But as a basic component, the fiscal capacity cap is particularly punitive and disincentivizes natural resource development.
And do you have a ballpark estimate of how much Quebec and Ontario could be losing in this new calculation?
Well, no, again, we haven't suggested what formula should replace it. We want the conversation to happen about how it's broken and how it can be fixed. I mean, so that we have not said that we should be taking from Quebec to give to Newfoundland and Labrador. That's not the intent. The intent is fairness for all Canadians, and to have that first conversation about how this formula can better support jurisdictions like Newfoundland and Labrador are small. We know that we do well when the price of oil is well, but when the price of oil goes down, or when oil goes away, potentially 20, 40, 50, 60 years from now, or there's a different need for it, then that would be a problem for us. So it needs to be, natural resources need to be contemplated differently. And oil is going to be here for a long time, by the way. I just want to say that.
Thank you.
Hello, Premiers. Michael Serapio from CPAC. Premier Eby, I want to get some clarification from you. So the decision is that British Columbia will support Newfoundland and Labrador's challenge. It will not necessarily join that challenge. And maybe I have the languaging wrong on this, and you can clarify. But why not join Newfoundland? Would there not be greater power in issuing a constitutional challenge from two provinces rather than just one?
Thanks. So our commitment to Newfoundland for their litigation is they will have full access to British Columbia for their legal team in preparing the evidence base, preparing arguments and sharing perspectives, and doing whatever we can to assist from the British Columbia side. It's unusual at the trial level to be intervening, but we'll have that conversation about whether it's beneficial to intervene at the trial level or whether to wait until the Court of Appeal level for British Columbia to intervene. The reason we're not joining or not anticipating joining in Newfoundland with specifically Newfoundland's case is that we have arguments that we'd like to bring that are in some cases contradictory to Newfoundland's arguments about how this thing should move forward. We have a distinct perspective that we think should be part of the litigation, and the spirit of our concerns is the same, but there are technical matters where we disagree. And so the thinking is it might be better for us in British Columbia to launch our own challenge and then to meet at the Supreme Court of Canada and to coordinate our actions that way. There's a lot of work yet to be done, but I wanted to make sure, given this opportunity to be around the table with other premiers, to share British Columbia's perspective with them so that we can have any conversations about anxieties other premiers may have, and to take the opportunity that I had with the premier to share with Canadians that we're going to stand up for British Columbians on the issue of equalization and fair treatment for all British Columbians to make sure that that this program is actually working for them and supporting them because it's not currently.
Follow-up question to you, Premier Furey. You know, the challenge has been launched. I'm wondering, though, because the premiers are here in Halifax, obviously this has become a matter of discussion for every day that you've been here. Does this necessarily have to go through the courts? What are the behind-the-scenes discussions happening, potentially with Ottawa even, to try to nip this in the bud rather than the courts deciding this?
Well, I'd be happy to find a resolution outside the courts. Courts take time, they take money, as we already discussed. But we'd be open to a conversation with Ottawa, and I'm sure you don't want to speak for you, but you know, if there's a mechanism to resolve this without using the judicial route, we'd be open to having a diplomatic conversation. But as we wrote letters before launching the challenge, we've asked for conversation before launching the challenge, and there was no appetite to have a broader conversation about the formula. So that's why we had to go the judicial route.
For us, obviously, for British Columbians, extremely reluctant to take this step. When I was sworn in as Premier, I had the perspective that British Columbians could best be served by being very present in Ottawa, building a lot of relationships, ensuring that they understood our perspectives, that our underfunding on many federal programs was a result of the fact that we're just so physically far away from Ottawa. And I've been corrected in that view. We have built a relationship. We've done the work. There is no question the federal government understands our frustrations, our concerns, our anxieties. Direct communications with the Prime Minister, with ministers, correspondence. It has not mattered. And so it's obvious that political considerations are blocking the ability of the federal government to prioritize the needs of British Columbians, whether it's around basic infrastructure like a tunnel that keeps transit moving, that keeps cars moving and trucks moving along a major trade corridor in British Columbia that they committed to fund, that they won't fund, whether it's around fairness in the equalization formula and how strange it is that BC taxpayers would send money to Ontario. We just can't get these issues resolved. And if politics are in the way, then and we're not able to get there because of politics, then we have to go to court. And I'm glad and appreciative that Newfoundland has taken that step, and we're able to support that. And we'll look at taking our own steps in British Columbia if we feel that would assist this effort.
And that's all the time we have today. Thanks.